This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 527 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The first and hopefully the last, but unfortunately probably not the last, big fantasy football injury was announced on Tuesday. Cam Akers, torn Achilles, out for the season. One of the more polarizing early round players isn't playing this year. So what now? Well, let me get it out of the way that I don't think backup Darrell Henderson just becomes Cam Akers. Sometimes we get situations where a backup running back being elevated to starter actually means that the backup is a better fantasy asset than the starter initially was. A good example of that was when Kareem Hunt took over as a rookie in 2017 for the Chiefs when Spencer Ware hurt his knee. Hunt was elevated ahead of where Spencer Ware was being drafted, and it was because he wasn't going to split the backfield with anyone. Spencer Ware was going to lose touches to Kareem Hunt, but Kareem Hunt without Spencer Ware was going to lose touches to no one. I don't see that happening to Darrell Henderson. Henderson wasn't a workhorse in college, and he hasn't been a workhorse so far in the NFL. The NFL seasons are obviously most important here too, because he's playing for the same head coach that he's played for over the last 2 years. In those 2 seasons, Henderson's exceeded an 80% running back rush share in just 1 game, and he's seen half of his team's running back rushes just 6 times. And that includes games where rookie Cam Akers was banged up. Now, of course, Malcolm Brown was there last year, and he's not there anymore. In fact, the Rams' depth chart is filled with unproven players. But then I go back to what the Rams have done through their actions. After Henderson's rookie year, instead of just making him the clear-cut starter, they went out and they used their precious draft capital on Cam Akers. Akers ended up being a higher pick than Darrell Henderson was the previous season. To me, that tells me the Rams didn't really think of Henderson as their obvious 3-down back. If they did, they would have never drafted Cam Akers. If they didn't feel that way then why should we assume they feel that way now? Now, that's just the argument against Henderson simply being Cam Akers. The fact is, the offense is good on paper. So even in somewhat of a split backfield, Henderson can be okay as an RB2. My rankings, which you can get for free over on NumberFire right now, they have Henderson at RB20. I wouldn't be shocked if the Rams go out and sign someone or even go out and trade for someone. And as a result, that's really where the risk lies with Darrell Henderson. Of course, if Henderson's the workhorse back, he's going to be strong. He's going to be a very good fantasy asset. But I don't know that we can bank on that right now. But let's be honest, there are definitely worse backups in the league. I know I just said bad things about his profile, but that's just in relation to him being a workhorse back. He was a really interesting prospect coming out of college who showed crazy efficiency. And he can catch passes well out of the backfield. I just worry about the ceiling. And honestly, I worry about how the Rams just generally view him. That's why he's more of an RB2. And one that could go in a lot of different directions from now until the start of the season. So there's my take on that backfield. I do think you could boost the passing numbers in that offense a little bit as well. Not because I think Cam Akers changes the dynamic of that team drastically, but because the Rams, who have been pretty run-heavy close to the end zone under Sean McVay, they may be more inclined to throw the ball around there now if they don't trust their running back. I just don't think it changes things enough to move players into new tiers. Now, today's a mailbag episode, but baseball fans, don't forget about the MLB Home Run Challenge over on FanDuel. Here's how it works. Each day you can draft 3 players. You'll then receive 1 point for every home run they hit. Score 3 points for a share of the $2,000 prize pool, and score 6 or more points, and you'll win a share of the $10,000 prize pool. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today and draft your sluggers. Eligibility restrictions apply. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first question this week is an email that says, "Hi JJ, thanks for the informative episode on finding breakout wide receivers. One name that came to mind was DJ Chark. I guess you could say he broke out in 2019, but got hurt last year, and now he's available in the middle rounds. Do you expect him to break out again or return to his 2019 stats? Either way, it seems like he might fit some of your criteria and be a value. Love the pod. Sincerely, Jeremy." Okay, so I got probably a dozen messages from people this week after that breakout wide receiver episode where someone would say, "Well, what about this guy?" or "How about this guy?" I know exactly why that's how you're reacting to the episode. You're trying to find players who fit some of the criteria that I laid out, and you want some confirmation. You want confirmation that you're looking at it the right way. I totally get it. But let me try to be totally clear here. A lot of players fit some of the criteria. Like a lot of them. That's why I keep trying to reiterate that the studies may honestly be more important regarding who to fade rather than who to target. But even if you want to focus on who to target, which you still should, keep in mind that there are layers to all of this. I mentioned some players at the end of the show last week who jumped to mind based on all the criteria. And I try to come at it from a perspective that those players fit a whole lot of the criteria. But someone like Chase Claypool or T. Higgins, yeah, I'm very into them too. Just because they're not the first wide receiver being drafted from their team doesn't mean I'm not into them. At the end of the day, you can't only draft wide receiver ones in fantasy football. You can try, but it would be pretty difficult because there are only 32 of them. You basically have to take team non-wide receiver ones. And team non-wide receiver ones are still hitting. It would be impossible for them not to, considering the sheer number that we're drafting after round 5. So if you use some of the other criteria, it can help you increase your probability of hitting on those team wide receiver 2s. Like targeting second-year players. It's why we should still be really intrigued by Jerry Jeudy, Chase Claypool, and T. Higgins. Jeudy could very easily be the wide receiver 1 on the Broncos by ADP by the time August hits. He already is on some platforms. The point I'm trying to make here is that there are going to be a lot of players who fit this mold fairly well. There are also going to be a group of players who don't at all. And those are the players you probably don't want to draft. When it comes to DJ Chark, he does have teammates going near him in drafts, mainly Laviska Shenault. And we found that team wide receiver ones who don't have those teammates being drafted near them, they tend to do better in terms of exceeding expectation. I would just try to take each of the points in the show layer by layer and apply those layers to wide receivers in the middle and late rounds. You want team wide receiver ones. You also want those wide receiver ones to be more standalone in those middle rounds, without teammates near them, aside from a teammate tight end. But you also want year 2 players. A match between the two, that's ideal. But you're not always going to get that. So instead, you separate the pieces of information and try to find the best matches. Hopefully that helps any of you who are trying to figure out specific examples after that show. Like I said on last week's Mailbag episode about running backs, it's really important to take a step back first and be a little bit looser with how you're blanketing the criteria. It's about probability, not absolutes. This next question is also an email. It says, JJ, does your latest analysis suggest we shouldn't look for the cheapest or cheaper running back in an uncertain backfield? That's kind of been a classic rule or assumption over the years, that essentially we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes, and thus we should take the value. Does this analysis suggest ADP, i.e. the market, is pretty smart, or at least smarter than we think? Any thoughts on where the original logic originated? All the best, love the show, Adam. Yes, this is exactly what the analysis is saying. And this is exactly why I was so excited to share the analysis on the running back position. Because of exactly what you said. I've been guilty of it plenty of times in the past, where I've said, I'll just get the cheaper of the 2 players in a backfield. When in reality, you should be doing the opposite. At least when you have a situation where the RB1 and the RB2 from one backfield, where they're being drafted close together in the middle rounds. It does show that the market isn't nearly as bad as we think at picking out who the RB1 is in a backfield. Now, sometimes those situations vary from ADP source to ADP source. I said that last week. But when it's a little bit more obvious, like with Jacksonville or Denver right now, then you should be attacking the RB1. And that brings me to the next question. This one says, hi JJ, my name is Andrew M. Hello, Andrew M. I'm a big fan of your pod. Definitely one I would highly recommend for improving overall process and decision making. Thank you. My question is just with Chase Edmonds. While I did find the study on number 1 backs in ambiguous backfields with another highly drafted teammate to be very enlightening, I still can't get on board with Edmonds' ADP. It just feels like a huge leap of faith for me to assume a guy who's had very limited usage and production through the first 3 years of his career is a good bet to do so now, even with limited competition. Isn't usage generally an indicator of talent? I feel like he's had about similar usage with Tony Pollard through 3 years. Someone who is a straight handcuff to one of the biggest name running backs in the league. And that tells me that he just might not be good enough to earn a workhorse / bell cow role. I understand running backs don't matter, but how can we be so confident as to invest a 6th round pick in someone who's never been trusted with a large role by his team? Nick Chubb hasn't stopped Kareem Hunt from being productive. Has there been any type of study done on the hit rate of running backs who have done very little through the first 3 years of their career, who have a modestly high ADP like Edmonds paying off. I know this probably would be a small sample since guys who haven't been productive through 3 seasons probably are very rarely taken in the top 10 rounds by fantasy drafters. But isn't that kind of the point? What makes Edmonds so exceptional to dismiss the lack of production? Hoping you can provide me some insight, JJ. Thanks and have a good rest of your summer. You too, Andrew M. I've been tagged in a lot of Chase Edmonds tweets since I published that running back episode. A lot of people don't like him. And I get it because I was on that side literally right before I completed the study on breakout running backs. That's why all of this is weird to me. I'm apparently a voice for Chase Edmonds stands now. But let's address this question because I do think there are a ton of valid points in it. First off, overall, I would agree with a lot of what you're saying. A player who hasn't had a significant workload until this point in his career, the expectation shouldn't be that he takes this massive leap in work. But I'd argue that that's not the expectation for Chase Edmonds. If it was the expectation, then he'd be a second round pick. And you know how I know that? Because Kenyon Drake from this same team was a second round pick last year in fantasy football under those assumptions. Edmonds is a 6th and often 7th round pick. And he's being drafted there after finishing with 10.5 PPR points per game last year. And now his backfield teammate is with another team. And for what it's worth, he's usually going like 10 picks after Kareem Hunt, which was the example that you used in this question. And Kareem Hunt can do well with Nick Chubb because of the circumstances on that Browns team. This is a completely different offense. Now, maybe Chase Edmonds' receiving touchdowns should have been lower last year. But let's not overstate what's happening here. He's coming off a season where he saw a 12.3% target share in one of the more friendly fantasy offenses in all football. At the very least, he's a strong pass-catching back. And I think that's what's being missed a little bit with this question here. Chase Edmonds and Tony Pollard have not had the same type of workloads at all over the last couple of seasons. Pollard's top target share came last year and it was 6.5%. And yes, it's because he's playing behind Ezekiel Elliott. That's going to happen. But Edmonds was almost double that. On the ground, we may have seen similar volume from the two over the past couple of years. But receiving is the reason that we can feel good about a baseline with Chase Edmonds in the first place. So we can't downplay that for the sake of argument. Now, of course, you don't want to just draft a player in the 6th or 7th round and have him merely meet expectation. That's not going to win a fantasy championship. And I understand your argument is likely tied to upside with Chase Edmonds. I mean, that was my argument with Edmonds earlier in the offseason. He's only seen 1 goal line carry his entire career. But my approach to fantasy football is that when we see the market making a general assumption about a player, and when that assumption isn't set in stone at all, we should probably buy. This is really another reason my opinion shifted with Chase Edmonds. It's not as though Chase Edmonds has a 0% chance to see more goal line work this year. Now that Kenyon Drake is gone. There's not a 0% chance that Edmonds hits 200 carries this year. That can still happen. He may not be a massive running back size-wise, but he hit 250 plus carries in 3 of 4 college seasons. The one season he didn't, he only played 7 games. We know Edmonds is going to give us some sort of floor production based on his receiving. And to be honest, that alone, his receiving production alone, should make him a middle round running back selection, which he is. But on top of that, we then have this question mark of, well, what if they really do feature Chase Edmonds? Not that we should expect 20 carries per game, but what if we end up seeing 12 or 13 carries per game and James Conner still plays a pretty big early down role? We've seen seasons like that pan out historically in the middle rounds and the late rounds of fantasy drafts. One of the key breakout running back indicators is that the running back is a pass catcher. He's someone who sees a disproportionate amount of touches come through the air. That's likely still going to be Chase Edmonds. It doesn't mean he won't see work on the ground or that he can't come close to that 200 carry mark. But we've seen players in the past with a heavier receiving profile do well in this area of the draft. Lamar Miller comes to mind as a very easy comp. But we know players like Austin Eckler or Darren Sproles or James White or Danny Woodhead or Dion Lewis. It's not like these types of things never have happened. It's just that in Edmonds' case, his workload wouldn't lean as heavily through the air. Now, to be clear, I don't like Edmonds as a true breakout candidate more than someone like Javonte Williams or Travis Etienne. But I've bought into him more and more after that breakout analysis was done. His ADP really is not that bad. The opportunity cost where you get him is not significant. I mean, in recent best ball drafts, you're getting him right ahead of Juju Smith-Schuster and Laviska Shenault, and right after Tyler Boyd. Let's not pretend like those players are locked in to win you fantasy titles. Edmonds is a good bet to exceed expectation. I'd say he's not as good of a bet to far exceed it as someone like Javonte Williams or Travis Etienne, but it's still in his range of outcomes. And it's something worth betting on, I think, given all the material that I talked about last week. This next question is from @SwaveSwaverson. Do you agree that OBJ is being drafted at his floor given he has a healthy season? Is there any chance everyone is wrong thinking that he will never be a weekly wide receiver one play anymore? I don't think we can say he's being drafted at his floor when he's averaged 12 to 13 PPR points per game during his 2 seasons in Cleveland. Is he a good bet to meet expectation at his ADP? Yeah, probably. But ADP isn't simply about seeing which players can meet expectation. We're looking for high upside players. So people are going to opt for guys like Chase Claypool or Brandon Ayuk who have more variance to their profiles in that area of the draft. Or at least they appear as if they do. Now, I do think OBJ is a pretty interesting draft selection this year for a lot of reasons that I talked about on Monday's episode. He's his team's wide receiver one. That's a big plus. And I'm still a believer in the talent. And like I said before on the show, we're all making the assumption that the Browns will be super run heavy, which they do project to be. But what if they're a little bit more pass friendly than we're assuming? All of a sudden, OBJ becomes even more valuable. So considering his target share projection, I think he's a strong wide receiver 3 choice for your fantasy teams this year. Like, I have no problem with OBJ whatsoever. I think there's still a decent ceiling in there if things hit. But I don't think that we can consider this his floor, just given how competitive wide receiver is and the high upside players that are also going around him in drafts. This next question says, "Hey JJ, hope this email finds you well. I can't fathom the Najee Harris hype right now. I'm seeing his ADP and ECR squarely in the second round. He's got an old quarterback in decline, a torn down offensive line, and he's in an offense that ran the ball at a very low rate last year. I understand he has the draft capital and very limited competition for running back work, but I don't see how someone can justify drafting him over a guy like Chris Carson. What am I missing here, especially from a process standpoint? Best, Nick." So I have Najee Harris at RB13 in my rankings, which means I'm totally aligned with how the market is viewing him. The bottom line in fantasy football is that you want volume. Najee Harris is a lock to see a ton of volume in the Steelers offense. They're trying to win right now. They spent a first round pick to get him. They don't have good quality depth. He was an incredible prospect. I mean, the list goes on and on as to why he'll see workhorse volume. I don't think that part can really be debated. You mentioned the situation. I think each of those points that you made, while they're not wrong, they can at least be argued. Ben Roethlisberger is not great. I would agree. There are better quarterbacks in the league for a running back. But he's made note that last year was tough coming off that elbow injury. The offensive line is projected to be bad, but it's almost impossible for it to be worse than it was last year. And we're also not very good at projecting offensive line play to begin with. And the offense has been pass heavy. But number one, that doesn't necessarily matter if the running back is a high projected target share, which Najee Harris has. But number two, they're likely not going to be as pass heavy given their investment in Najee Harris. I think there are a lot of running backs in that range who you could argue over Harris. Don't get me wrong. Chris Carson included. Carson's a great value. But those are the reasons that Najee is ranked where he's ranked. It first and foremost has to do with volume. The last question this week is another email. It says, "Hey JJ, are you able to touch on CEH, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and his peripherals? He obviously disappointed last year, and there are a number of narratives surrounding his fantasy output. Is he being slept on, potentially having a 15-plus touchdown season? Kind regards, Cal from Down Under." The big thing that worries people with Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the fact that he had all those goal line rushes to start the year last year, and then he sort of just disappeared. In week 1 last year, the Chiefs ran 8 plays from within the opponent's 5-yard line. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had all 6 of Kansas City's rushes from that area of the field, and he went for -2 yards and 0 touchdowns. Here's the thing though, from week 2 through the Super Bowl, Kansas City ran 41 plays at the goal line. So they had 8 in week 1 and they had 41 from then on. 25 of those plays were passes. 16 of them were rushes. Of the 16, Clyde Edwards-Helaire had 4 of them for 6 yards and 2 touchdowns. Patrick Mahomes had 3, and Le'Veon Bell had 3 as well. So CEH's share definitely dipped. He had 25% of their goal line rushes versus 100% of them in week 1. But he wasn't bad on the limited sample after that week 1 game. And without Le'Veon Bell there, and with CEH being another year in the league and not being a rookie, it's easy to see him seeing a little bit more work close to the goal line, or at least having that chance. I don't think it's going to be all of the work, but he should see some more work close to the goal line. I mean, the bottom line here is that last year, we had a rookie who averaged a 68% running back rush share per game and an 11.5% target share per game in one of the best offenses in football. And it's one that projects to be one of the best this year. Those are really strong market share numbers for a rookie. People were just so down on CEH because he didn't totally live up to the hype in year one. So in the end, I'm more in on CEH this year than out. 15 plus touchdowns is a lot, so I wouldn't go that high. But in that Chiefs offense, he's got just as high of a ceiling as anyone who's being drafted around him. And you could argue that the ceiling is actually higher than anyone being drafted around him. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. I will have the tight end breakout show for you early next week. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend.